set bonus going into this tier as well. So yeah, I think this is something that will work even better in the future seasons. Although I don't know, the 10.1 stuff with normal is more valuable next season because of the upgrades from it. So we'll see what that does. I have an open mind for it though, and I do think that it's probably worth doing this simultaneous release for the M plus side of things.
I agree.
So,
I think that I tend to agree. Like, does it hurt you and I individually? Yes. I'm not going to like stop advocating for my own best interest. I want to make that like perfectly clear that it is negatively affecting me. If I'm asked though, is it fine if it negatively affects me this much to allow players to be able to get access to Mythic Plus earlier, like in an unlocked level? The answer, at least in my opinion, is yes. I think that, and while it does kind of suck a little bit for me, at the same point, I understand why Blizzard's looking to do it this way, and I think it should continue this way. Okay, last thing I think that we need to cover from the raid is Inspiration Catalyst. And I think the only reason we necessarily need to cover the Inspiration Catalyst in context of raid is because I think the raid is holding back the Inspiration Catalyst unlock timing a little bit. Now it opens the week of January 16th. Now this is something that is 6 weeks out. It was the exact same cadence as Sepulchre. Blizzard released a pretty big blue post, and you and I covered a lot of the key points of that blue post a few episodes ago on the series. And overall, though, I think the Inspiration Catalyst as a system is excellent. And I think that whenever you're giving feedback with the Inspiration Catalyst, you need to continue to keep that in mind, that the Inspiration Catalyst of being able to allow players to get tier is very, very good for the game. And I think that you need to make sure whenever you're giving feedback that is still heard. Now, the timing on the Inspiration Catalyst, I'm still not a fan of. I know that you and I have gone back and forth on this a little bit. I think that this is still too late for just average players, and I think that it creates apathy because it's just like, oh, why play until the Inspiration Catalyst? Or I'm playing with somebody who has their 4-set. Of course, I'm going to get sauced and damage, and it's just less fun because I don't have my 4-set. There's like a lot that goes into it. I think that this was a little bit of a miss on the patch, though.
Yeah, it's tough because I see what they're going for, and I think that what the stuff they're trying to do next patch is going to be a good move on this. I think like so next patch, right, we're going to be able to get an Omni token for clearing heroic, or for getting like 2400 in M plus, something like that. I think 2200 in M plus, which that seems like a pretty good, improvement to tier availability. The Omni tokens from the last boss as well that are going to drop. It seems like tier is going to be much more available next patch, and also it's going to feel a lot less bad to have 2-piece instead of just 2-piece. Right?
Yeah, sure.
So, it should be better next time, even without moving the catalyst up. But it definitely does suck that they come up with this great idea for making tier better, this catalyst, and overwhelmingly, if you talk about the catalyst, people have a negative reaction to it because the timing of it has been just it's been so late in the patch, the last 2 patches, and it's tough because I understand like Blizzard they want you to be like, oh yeah, I want to clear the raid this week so I can get my tier set, right? And the more they make it so you don't have to clear the raid this week to get your tier set, the less people are going to go into the raid, and the harder it's going to be to form raid groups and stuff. And I can see where that all comes from. It's just maybe set bonuses are outdated as something to gate from players.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I think that overall the raid was, I didn't think it was too bad. Like especially all the stuff that accompanied it. Maybe the bosses, but like individually, were a little bit on the worse end.
I mean, like the bosses, the very rare items, like there were a lot of problems when you look at this raid. But then it was still a lot of fun, which to me is a really good sign because it probably means that the core of how the classes are playing, how the talent builds are working out,
the game
is strong, and that means that like if they do a raid where the bosses are good, that's going to be really good, right? Like that's going to be insane. If we're having this much fun in a bit of a stinker of a raid, right? Then that means that the next raid is going to be it can only go up from here, right?
Okay, so let's talk about the dungeons now, and like M plus and the dungeon pool and that kind of thing in regards to like a retrospective for 10.0. So the dungeon pool that we had was Algathar Academy, Court of Stars, Halls of Valor, Ruby Life Pools, Shadow Moon Burial Grounds, Temple of the Jade Serpent, Azure Vault, and Noka Defensive. Coming into the expansion, a lot of people were pretty down on the playability of the dungeon pool just as a whole. They thought that, particularly things such as Azure Vault, Noka Defensive. I think that Azure Vault and Noka Defensive were the ones that were like, oh my god, I'm going to have unfun with the season because of these dungeons in particular. And I think that Blizzard continues to do this thing with M+, where they do iterative feedback, and they continue to iterate on dungeons long into the season, and that helps dungeons as a whole. Even as recently as a few weeks ago, we had changes to the Azure Vault timer and nerfing of Azure Blade, because players were continuing to just give feedback that either this dungeon is a little bit too hard relative to the timer, this boss is particularly annoying for these reasons. And I think that Blizzard, while things release sometimes in a weird state, they normally come around to making the dungeon pool a little bit better. And so I think that on launch, some things were a bit questionable with the dungeon pool, particularly like Alg Academy balancing with like the tree boss and stuff. But over time, the dungeon pool has grown on me a lot, and some of the dungeons that I wasn't a fan of coming into the expansion as Azure Vault and Nuka Defensive have actually become some of my more favorite dungeons to play.
Yeah, it's interesting because we started off this season, and I remember thinking like, oh, the best thing about Dragonflight Season 1 is that half the time my key is not a Dragonflight dungeon, right? Like half the time I don't have to go to Ruby Life Pools or Knockout or Azure Vault, right? And it's
yes.
But now, actually, at the end of the season, they've made some really good changes to those dungeons, and I think by far the weakest part of the season actually is the other dungeons.
Yeah,
aside from Halls of Valor, I think Halls of Valor is quite good.
Yes.
I think that one has been revamped well and fits well into the season. But Shadow Moon and Court are these just really wacky dungeons where they're much easier than the others at any given key level, and there's a lot of weird mobs that just do such non-modern things with how they just like don't do anything and then do a bunch of damage every 30 seconds or something like that, and then
melee you
again, and it's like they melee random targets, or they're doing just all kinds of weird stuff. Bone Maw is just this encounter that feels like it lasts 10 years,
yeah.
Right? So those dungeons, Temple as well. Temple, to me, it's like it's egregious to me that Temple hasn't seen changes in the way that Vault and Knockout and Algothar and Ruby all did. And Temple is just still there with like Shaw that get affected by the Raging Affix, and to me that like the season they did a really good job with the Dragonflight dungeons, which was my initial point of concern in this season was, oh man, these Dragonflight dungeons all suck. But I'm not convinced that old dungeons, older than like BFA, is a reasonable place to draw dungeons from, given how Court of Stars and Temple and Shadow Moon worked out here.
Overall, I think the dungeon pool kind of feels similar to me. It is like whenever we were talking about like the Vault of Incarnates bosses, I didn't think that the dungeon pool was like a particularly bright spot, but I had a ridiculous amount of fun playing this season, and I think that this more so than at least in Vault of the Incarnates actually comes down to like the talent tree revamp. And so the talent tree revamp really allowed the most amount of classes that I've seen in like a really long time to be meta. And I mean, even if we're looking at 25 and above, like there are so many different things that are at least playable. You see so many spikes that are over this 5% mark for amount of representation, even things that are over 3%. Like historically, we have a lot more representation this season just coming out of classes, even like this 25 and up range than ever before. And then obviously whenever you go down to 20s, pretty much everything is able to complete a 20 and go from that 20 to 25 range. And that's something that is historically unseen, and it happens to be because like the talent tree revamp allows players to design their kits to work for either the specific dungeon they're looking for, or to be more primarily AoE focused, which then allows for you to have setups that work for every different situation that you may be faced with. And that is super important. It allows for comp flexibility. Obviously, you're gonna need to like choose a comp that's good. Like even if your class isn't like the most meta thing, you're gonna have to pick something that works with you. But I think that I had a ton of fun playing this season, even if it isn't necessarily like the best dungeons.
Yeah, I think that as well. There's a lot of credit that should be given to Blizzard for frequent class balance and tuning here. If we look at previous seasons, there were some seasons where there were like egregious outliers in both directions that were untouched for 6 full months. This season's got a few. There's a few specs that you can point to and you can be like, okay, why is this thing not buffed, right? But realistically, like even if you point at some of the most obvious ones like Guardian Druid, like they did do some changes to Guardian Druid.
They buffed them 3 times.
Yeah, they buffed it, like, and they need to buff them some more, sure, but it's not like they're ignoring that one. And even if you look at the full set of specs, it's like, okay, there are 38 specs in the game, and they've been like tinkering with 20, 25 of them, right? Like the ones that were left alone are largely in good places, and there are a few that maybe aren't, but like either way, I think the pace of changes that are being made to specs and classes is really good, and they've done a great job as well of not really like gutting anything in the way that we've seen specs get gutted in the past from 1 week to another, right? Like you can imagine a 10.0.5 that took Prot Warrior into the dumpster, and it didn't happen, right? Prot Warrior is no longer the best tank, but it's still good and it's still powerful, and that's, I think, great.
So let's talk rotating dungeon pools. So you talked about some of the things like the old dungeons are maybe some of the ones that scare you the most. We have this dungeon pool that is completely being rotated out. Now we're going to be having 8 new dungeons, which are Halls of Infusion, Brackenhide Hollow, Vortex Pinnacle, Freehold, Underrot. Oh gosh, I'm missing 3.
Vortex Pinnacle, Vortex Pinnacle, Freehold, Underrot, Nelthlayer.
Nelthlayer.
The new dungeons are Brackenhide, Neltharus, Uldaman, Legacy of Tyr.
Okay.
And that last one.
Halls of Infusion,
Halls of Infusion,
we made it to 8. Okay, we got 8.
Together we've got them all.
Okay, so those 8 dungeons are being rotated in. I think that immediately right off the rip, I am excited but cautiously optimistic about the rotating dungeon pool. So the reason that I'm excited for the rotating dungeon pool is some of the most fun I have in M+ is whenever I'm learning the most. I'm learning new strategies. I'm like evolving over the course of the whole entire season, and I think that might not have been something that like Mythic Plus mains or players that are Mythic Plus enthusiast level players that do a lot of dungeons were able to have over the course of an entire expansion with only 8 dungeons. Because if you think about how stale the dungeons got during Shadowlands, I worry that would have happened without them rotating out the dungeons. Now, the cautious part of the cautiously optimistic has to do with balancing the dungeons, correct?
I feel like this. It's hard to evaluate this in the 10.0 retrospective. I think this is going to be something to look at in the 10.1 retrospective, because this 10.0 having 8 new dungeons is not new, right? 9.0 had 8 new dungeons. 8.0 had 8 new dungeons, right? So what's going to be different is that 10.1 is also going to have 8 new dungeons. Right. I agree with you that it's exciting, it's cool. There are balance concerns.
Correct.
There also is a degree of concern that I have that learning 8 new dungeons every 6 months is a lot of overhead, especially for players that don't play the game as much as
That's a good point.
You or I might. So I have a suspicion that it might be best to have 4 new dungeons each season and 4, returning from the previous season. Something like that might actually be the equilibrium that is healthiest, but I'm definitely excited to give it a try and go with the 8 full new ones. I think it's great that in general they're experimenting with M+ as much as they are.
All right, so at risk of this running too long, I think we need to hit affixes, but I don't think we need to hit them for like forever. I think that we've made multiple 30-minute videos on affixes. Thundering is the seasonal affix. I think that this one is just a massive miss. I think that pretty much anybody that you talk to about just affixes in general is going to kind of have a similar sentiment to where Thundering was just a huge miss in regards to seasonals. I think that in general it's just too punishing. The way you play Mythic Plus, it's not... Okay, you do preemptively play M+ some situations, but normally it's like around defensives. I'm not preemptively playing M+ around Thundering timings and like seasonal affixes, and the fact that if you mess it up, it just wipes you in most situations. I think if I get stunned by Thundering, I have a 95% chance that my group is wiping there. That just seems like such a blatant oversight.
Yeah, Thunder, it feels like it wasn't finished. The fact that the stun is just so brutal is, I don't know, at that point, why doesn't it just one-shot you, right? Like, just get it over with, if that's what it's supposed to be, right? But don't stun me for 6 seconds while I'm dying. Thundering is such a shame, because, like, it has... I like these mechanics of matching somebody with the opposite color as you. In Raid, I think those are cool mechanics. I like Star Augur, I like Danduin when they did those. I like Dunat a lot, right? Those are the bosses with that mechanic.
Yeah.
I think it worked well in Raid. And the idea of like a seasonal affix that offers you a 30% damage and healing buff as well, like that's cool, that's powerful, right? That's the kind of thing that we've been saying we wanted from seasonal affixes, and yet Thundering just has both of those things and yet really misses the mark. And it sucks because like I've really liked playing around seasonal affixes in the past, right? I loved thinking about what Shrouded, what Encrypted, what Reaping, even what Tormented, what those sorts of affixes would do to my dungeon run, what Awakened would do, right? Like that was so fun and cool. But Thundering, it's like this affix where I've tried to think, like, what are we supposed to do with this? And, you know, in some spots, it's like, oh, you know, like once every 4 or 5 dungeons, I get this spot where it's like, oh, looking at this Thundering timer, we can hold our Lust for 30
Yeah.
I can hold my Manic Grief Torch. I do that from time to time, and that's like maybe a little bit cool, but you know, half the time that I'm trying to hold my Manic Grief Torch for Thundering procs, I have to dodge a swirly, and then there's a boss mechanic coming out, and I'm just supposed to clear ways. Okay, I'm not like this is an affix where even when I'm trying to play around it, I often, the way that it's set up with the risk-reward scale is your silts are supposed to clear really quick, and yeah, I mean, I don't want this to turn into another video of us just saying Thundering sucks for 30 minutes, because we have made those videos in the past. It does suck.
It does suck, yep.
But I'm also sad to see Seasonals go, because Seasonals have been so cool in the past as well, but yeah. I think, again, props to the surrounding systems that the M Plus season was fun despite Thundering.
I agree with that. And another thing, too, that we got this season was a lower not affix pool, but like lower or shorter season.
Yeah,
it used to be 12 weeks. Now it's 10.
Inspiring, necrotic.
But those are gone. Yeah.
I think as well the shorter cadence. Like if there's going to be patches this frequently, I think 10 weeks instead of 12 is great. Make sure that we get through the full rotation once or twice before the new season comes out. Yeah, and the second time you see, you know, Fortified Spiteful Grievous, it's on a different patch than it was the first time, even if it's like a 0.0.5 or 0.0.7. So yeah, I think this is fine. It's worked out well. The weeks have done a reasonably good job of moving away from like the push week, dead week cycle to 10 reasonably playable weeks. Obviously, some are better than others, and some have a much nastier profile if you're in a pug or a group without a soothe, or you know, a group with a tank that doesn't play around Sanguine or whatever. Like, sure, that does still exist, but yeah, I think the what they did with the affixes worked pretty well. Yeah,
I think that what they did with the affixes worked pretty well. Obviously, we're seeing like pretty massive sweeping changes to affixes from 10.1, and so I think that like, oh yeah, we could just like pick apart. Oh, the issue quaking at the beginning of the expansion was so annoying. But like, and we could obviously go on for a while talking about just like, oh, affix is too impactful for healers, but this is something that we obviously know is getting massively changed in 10.1, and so yeah, you know, the affix rotation could have been better. Seasonal affix could have been better. I think that overall, though, I had a lot of fun playing this season. So the last thing I want to hit is like patch cadence in like 10.0.7. I think that for like patch cadence, at least from my perspective, 10.0.5, it brought like a couple of changes to a couple of classes, particularly Priest and Druid got a little bit of changes. I thought that was really interesting because never before have we seen Blizzard be willing to kind of hammer into classes in the middle of an expansion, and that was a bit promising. 10.0.7 had Forbidden Reach and then like a Paladin change, and again, to me, kind of promising to see them continuing to iterate on classes. The Forbidden Reach and the Onyx Amulet in particular are a bit of a miss in my mind, but the fact that they're attached to 10.0.7 and not supposed to be this big long-term massive 0.1 patch or something like that, that's cool. Like, I'm not going to complain about a 0.7 patch having new content for me to be doing, especially new content that's not like, breaking the game in any way.
Yeah, I think 10.0.7 was cool. The thing that I like about it most is alt catch-up at this point in the patch is now really nice as well. So,
sure.
You know, if you want to play something different in 10.1 than you did in 10.0, you level up the character, you do Forbidden Reach for a couple days, you've got like full 395 tier, and then you're ready to jump into whatever content you want to get better gear in preparation for next patch, or that gear is just good enough to take you into early next patch and let you start getting the upgrades out of there. So I thought that was cool. I thought the Forbidden Reach zone was neat.
The zone was cool.
Yeah, the place is cool. You know, the Zeskara vaults are actually really cool. That place is kind of awesome. I think
the ring doesn't feel finished.
Cool. Yeah, the ring is a bit weak, I think, especially because like it seems like a bit of a miss to me because it's got these like minor procs that you don't actually see or feel in your rotation.
Yeah.
So when you think about that, that's like, okay, this is going to be something that like min-maxers are going to like, right? Hardcore players are going to like because it's a damage increase. But then the ring is kind of aimed and tuned in such a way where it's a big deal for casual players, for players that don't have access to good rings already from the raid. You know, if you already have good rings from the raid, there's a good chance your spec isn't even interested in the amulet. So it seems to me like if there's something like the Onyx Amulet they're going to add in this 0.0.7 patch, like maybe it should be instead of being like all of these little damage procs that you kind of have to like sim and find out which one the best one is, and it should instead be like something flashy, something something that transforms you into a Drakthir for a little bit and is some kind of like powerful effect, cool like that. That the more casual players would also get something out of, because I feel like the stones are supposed to read like interesting, cool combinations to think about, but then they're all just 2 DPS of fire, 2 DPS of shadow, right? Like, what's going on here? But either way, it's just not something to complain too much about, because again, the fact that they put this sort of thing in a 0.0.7 patch instead of a 0.1 or 0.2 patch means that it's just not. It can't do that much bad stuff to the raid, which domination shards were kind of an example of a similar system that came out in the middle of a raid, and that was catastrophic.
So I think overall, just kind of my thoughts on the whole entire 10.0 landscape is this patch from 10.0 to 10.0.7, and then like honestly moving into 10.1 has kept me more engaged than I have been in a while. I've been continuing to play the game longer because, at least in my mind, I still have like unfinished business with like N+. I'm continuing to grind through dungeons. I'm continuing to learn stuff over time. Obviously, the 10.0.5 and 10.0.7 didn't reinvent something to where I needed to like drastically change up my gameplay, so it wasn't keeping me involved in regards to like brand new content or whatever. But I think that more than ever, at least, like WoW has kept me engaged for an extended period of time, and obviously I'm somebody who plays the game like a significant amount, so that's good for me. I'm really happy with the current state of the game. I hope that it continues to improve in 10.1. Dennis, what are your final thoughts on like this patch?
Yeah, me too. I mean, I think that they took a big swing with a huge set of core changes to how the game worked in Dragonflight. So the fact that it's been as smooth as it has been is really great.
Dude, I can't believe.
But
this
yeah,
still.
I like you also play the game a lot, right? So I'm curious to know what others think about it. Definitely let us know in the comments below what your opinions were on the Dragonflight launch in general, the 10.0 cycle, the stuff they're choosing to bring forward into 10.1.
Yeah.
And that's going to be it for us this week. We will see you next week.
Make sure to mark your calendars for May 2nd. Patch goes live.
Inventory is full. I can't carry anymore. Inventory is full. I can't carry any more. Inventory is full.
I'm working on a dish I call Mudrock Soup and Bugs. I still need the major ingredients and, well, I don't think I'd last long trudging through Dustwallow Marsh. So, adventurer, can you do some hunting for me? First, I need the tongues of Mudrock turtles. You can find mudrocks along the coast, mostly around the bay. But I don't want just any tongues. I hear that the tongues of some mudrocks are forked. They say the forked tongues have a distinct flavor, and I want that flavor in my dish. I can't help it if I feel sorry for old Jim there. He wasn't always like that. Ran an inn out in the marsh for a while, wonderful place. Look, I don't really want to talk about it. Bring it up with Captain Vimes if you really have to. James Hiles is his real name. He opened an inn at the edge of the Barrens. Wanted to make a nice place for travelers to stop over. Might be he was thinking too big, but the inn did do well for a while. Then we lost control of the roads in the marsh and the ogres took over. James was too stubborn to give up his dream for safety within our walls, and the Shady Rest Inn was burnt to the ground. We're investigating, but haven't had much luck. If you want to help out, see what you can find in the rubble. I like cooking. Good swamp cooking. Fried green frog legs and the like. And for cooking I need spice. Soothing spice. Then I'll make a stew and stew it up and suck it down and give you some too. You like stew?
Inventory is full.
This is Monday Sales CRM, an intuitive CRM that helps you actually close deals. Say hello to Michael, one of our new leads. Easily qualify him and watch the magic happen. Michael is now connected to all of our boards with only one click. Here you are. You and your team can track and manage Michael's deal in one place. You can send him emails, set meetings, and smoothly pass through all the stages to win the deal. And now, the moment you've been waiting for. You can close the deal. Woohoo! Wait, get this. Automations. Use our automations and save you and your team hours of repetitive work. Huh, look at that. Your sales manager just got notified. And finally, dashboards. Get a bird's eye view of all your team's deals and customize your sales dashboard so it's exactly as you want it. Sorry, Michael, you're not our only deal. Monday Sales CRM, an intuitive CRM you'll actually want to use. Try Monday Sales CRM today.
Welcome to Audit the Audit, where we sort out the who and the what and the right and wrong of police interactions. This episode covers stop and ID laws, obstruction, and unlawful seizures, and is brought to us by Long Island Audit's channel. Be sure to check out the description below and give them the credit that they deserve. On October 31st, 2022, officers Di Natale and Yeldell of the Trenton Police Department stopped Mr. Daniel and Ms. Myra on the street after being dispatched to a call that described a male and female in a gray truck with Pennsylvania tags. Long Island Audit stated in his video that the officers were responding to a call regarding a custody dispute, although Mr. Daniel and Ms. Myra's role in the alleged dispute was unclear. The interaction that followed was captured on Officer Di Natale's body camera.
Somebody else riding in the truck with you? Y'all just got out of the truck?
Wait, you said somebody riding it?
Y'all just got out of this truck, right? No. Parked there for a while. Were y'all just sitting in the truck?
I mean...
Yes, right? You was just sitting in the truck?
You just sit...
What?
I don't know what's the question. I don't want to incriminate myself. You're not incriminating yourself, you're answering a question. Which can potentially incriminate myself, so I don't answer questions. We were here for a long time.
No, I'm not worried about if you was here for a long time or not. It's pertaining to the call, but you're not in any trouble.
We're here for a call for service. We're trying to see if you. My partner's asking you a question to see if you pertain to the call. If you don't, then you'll be on your way, and we'll be on our way handling our job. No, it's fine. I understand. There's no need to get smart with me. No, I'm not trying to get smart with you. I was just saying, like, I don't want to get in trouble for doing nothing wrong. Okay. You know what I mean? I'm just standing here. There's no need to get smart with a police officer. I wasn't trying to get smart with you. Okay. Keep it that way. I'm not trying to give you a hard time. Keep it that way. Can you give a description of the vehicle?
Said it was a Dodge Ram truck, red in color, and she gave me a plate.
You guys get a call for a Dodge Ram truck? Yes, we got a call for you too. Place, so you guys pull up here? And you have a responsibility to check it out. If you guys are doing nothing wrong, then you guys are doing nothing wrong. That's fine. I'm just curious. Do you guys have IDs just so I can see who I'm talking with? I do, but I don't feel like I have to give it to you. Well, you do. I don't. I'm telling you, you do. In the state of New Jersey, it's an non-ID state. I haven't committed a crime.
Officer Di Natale demands Mr. Daniel identify himself as part of an investigation, and Mr. Daniel refuses, arguing that New Jersey is not a stop and ID state. As we have discussed many times here on ATA, stop and identify statutes are laws that authorize law enforcement officers to arrest citizens if they refuse to identify themselves under certain circumstances. Beginning with the landmark Terry case, the Supreme Court has consistently recognized that an officer's reasonable suspicion that an individual may be involved in criminal activity allows the officer to briefly detain them and take limited additional steps to investigate the situation further. Although it is well established that an officer may ask a suspect to identify himself during a Terry stop, prior to 2004, there was an open question regarding whether a suspect could be arrested and prosecuted for refusing to answer. This issue was resolved in the case of Hybel versus Nevada, where the Supreme Court held that Terry principles authorize states to enact laws requiring suspects to disclose their names if They are legally detained based on reasonable suspicion. In upholding an individual's arrest for refusing to identify himself, the court in Highbowl emphasized that the Nevada statute was, quote, consistent with Fourth Amendment prohibitions against unreasonable searches and seizures, and that the stop in question was based on reasonable suspicion. However, because New Jersey is not a stop and ID state, New Jersey police officers typically cannot arrest an individual for refusing to identify themselves outside of a traffic stop, unless the officer is making an arrest or issuing a summons. Additionally, officers cannot compel individuals to identify themselves under threat of arrest without reasonable suspicion that they are involved in illegal activity, even if the state has a valid stop and identify statute in place. Long Island Audit reported that the officers were initially called for a custody dispute rather than a criminal offense, and although this information has not been externally confirmed, Officer Di Natale stated that the officers were responding to a call for service, and that their investigation did not mean Mr. Daniel had done anything wrong. Because it does not seem that the officers had the reasonable suspicion necessary to detain Mr. Daniel, it is unlikely that a court would find that Mr. Daniel was obligated to identify himself in this situation, even if New Jersey had a stop and identify law in place.
I haven't committed a crime. Can I have your name and badge number, by the way? Your badge number.
I need your IDs.
I need you guys' name and badge numbers. I'm interacting. I don't even know who you guys are. I'm interacting with police. You guys need to identify.
Right now.
Clear identifiers.
Okay, but I don't.
Cameras are running.
Why are you intimidating me like this?
I'm not intimidating you.
You came up to me really aggressively.
I'm not intimidating you.
Why are you being aggressive like this? I haven't committed a crime. You're trying to ID me. I haven't done anything wrong.
We got a call. My dispatchers are giving your vehicle with you guys being described.
You're trying to jump the gun and do weight. You're not.
3, 2, 1.
I'm not trying to cause any problem.
So we got called here, right? When we got here.
Alright, Tepper, what's the complaint about? Because we're out with these two parties. We're trying to identify them and figure out what's going on.
The truck was identified. Not you, not her. I asked whether or not you would sit in the truck because something could have been wrong with her, something could have been wrong with you. That's why I asked you, right? But then you got smart with me.
I wasn't trying to be smart. I wasn't trying to be smart.
We have an obligation, right? When we're talking with people and we get a call. And I'm not saying you two are doing anything wrong. But I'm going to call my dispatcher, as you heard on my radio, and I turned it up so you could hear. Male, female, Dodge Ram truck.
That's it. Did I do something wrong? No.
So I'm asking you to identify yourself.
And I am refusing to identify myself because I have not committed a crime. And in New Jersey, this is a non-ID state. I refuse to identify myself. You asked me, and I refused. I feel like
this is an investigation, and I'm asking you to
investigate.
And
fine. Investigate. I am not going to identify myself.
So now you're obstructing. So
I'm not obstructing. Obstructing.
The officer places Mr. Daniel in handcuffs, accusing him of obstruction for refusing to identify himself. Section 2C29-1 of the New Jersey Revised Statute states that, quote, a person commits an offense if he purposely obstructs, impairs, or perverts the administration of law or other governmental function, or prevents or attempts to prevent a public servant from lawfully performing an official function by means of flight, intimidation, force, violence, or physical interference or obstacle, or by means of any independently unlawful act. In the 1985 case of State v. Pearlstein, the Appellate Division of the Superior Court of New Jersey expressly indicated that the application of this statute is, quote, limited to situations where there is violent or physical interference, or where other acts occur which are unlawful independently of the purpose to obstruct government. Based in part on this decision, the same court held in the 2005 case State v. Camillo that an individual's failure to identify himself was insufficient to support a conviction for obstruction. In this case, the court held that Mr. Camillo's refusal to provide his name, date of birth, and social security number to a state trooper who needed the information to prepare an incident report did not constitute obstruction under Section 2C29-1. While Trooper Dykeman gave Mr. Camillo an ultimatum and said that he would be arrested and charged with obstruction if he did not provide the requested information, the court noted that, quote, simply obstructing, impairing, or perverting the administration of law or the governmental function was not a statutory violation, and that, quote, the obstruction must be carried out in a manner described in the statute, by means of flight, intimidation, force, violence, or physical interference or obstacle, or by means of any independently unlawful act. Because Mr. Camello did not physically interfere with Trooper Dykeman or otherwise violate the law, the court ultimately concluded that while Mr. Camello's actions may have obstructed the trooper from preparing his report, his conduct was not a violation of the obstruction statute. Based on this precedent, it is unlikely that a court would determine that Mr. Daniel committed obstruction by refusing to identify himself, even if his refusal actually limited the officer's ability to investigate.
Real happens here. Like pure thrills on the all-new Pipeline. Experience Real all year. Annual passes as low as $15 a month. No down payment. SeaWorld Orlando. Real amazing.
Living with schizophrenia, people wonder if I'm able to have a social life. They think I can't hang out with my friends. But I can. I DJ with my friends often. I feel good about treatment goals.
Talk to your doctor about schizophrenia treatment options.
I'm requesting a supervisor. I want a supervisor. I did nothing wrong.
No. Relax. You're obstructing.
I'm not obstructing.
Man, back up. You're going to be arrested. Back up.
I'm requesting a supervisor. You're not going to take the This is against my First Amendment. This is against my Fourth Amendment. Why are you putting me in? Why are you? Okay, I will get in. I'm not resisting. Sticking in my pockets. Sticking in my pockets.
No, what are you doing?
I'm patting you down. It's called search.
I want your badge number.
Okay, it's Officer Detail 7.
I'm requesting a supervisor.
Have a seat.
I'm requesting a supervisor. I'm a supervisor. Baby,
you're intimidating me.
I want bullets on the floor.
Excuse me. Excuse me. Oh my God! Don't touch me. Oh, I didn't do anything wrong. This is my legal right.
Stop.
This is my legal right. Don't touch me. Don't touch me. Don't touch me. I'm uncomfortable. Don't touch me. I'm not fighting.
Is this your phone prayer?
I want my supervisor. Baby, what? I know. I want a supervisor.
Both disorderly persons obstructing an investigation, didn't want ID. Told him he was being detained, didn't want to provide identification. Female started getting rowdy, started grabbing at us, trying to prevent us from searching him incidental to arrest. Both are under arrest for disorderly person. So Daniel, I want you to understand something. When the police are conducting an investigation, right, doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. But you have to identify, okay? It's called search incidental to arrest. So I pat you down, and I have to pat everywhere.
All right, but I'm being illegally arrested because I haven't committed a crime.
But it's not. It's called...
Not identifying myself is not illegal.
You're obstructing the administration of the investigation.
I'm not obstructing an investigation because I'm not identifying myself. That's not obstructing. I'm just trying to explain to you guys that I don't have to identify myself. I'm letting you guys know, look, I believe I'm a strong believer. I have identified myself, yes, of course. I'm being placed under arrest, so lawfully, under the law, I have to identify myself. Being suspicious is not a crime. I don't have to identify myself. So it's not obstruction.
So remember how I was saying dispatch? What I said our dispatchers are telling us? A male and a female in a Dodge Ram gray color pickup truck.
That's fine. That's fine, but you haven't observed any crime. I'm just standing.
So we have a right to
investigate.
Correct.
That's not
identify.
Right. You can ask me for identification. I can refuse to identify.
And if the party refuses, the police officer has an obligation to now, if they refuse to give information, we now detain. If they still refuse, it's an arrest.
Officer Di Natale claims that members of law enforcement have the authority to identify citizens during investigations, detain them if they will not identify themselves, and then arrest them if they still refuse to identify. Officer Di Natale seems to be referring to the three basic levels of police interactions: consensual encounters, investigatory detentions, and arrests. During a consensual encounter with a citizen, officers can ask questions, including an individual's name, without any suspicion they have committed a crime. However, as the Supreme Court stated in the 1983 case of Florida versus Royer, the individual, quote, need not answer any question put to him, and, quote, he may decline to listen to the questions at all and may go on his way. In order to detain an individual and prevent them from leaving a scene, officers must have reasonable suspicion that the individual is involved in criminal activity. And as the Royer case specifically noted, an individual's refusal to listen to an officer, answer their questions, or identify themselves themselves during a consensual encounter does not, without more, furnish grounds for detention. Although reasonable suspicion is a less demanding standard than probable cause, inarticulate hunches and an officer's good faith beliefs are insufficient to justify a detention. And, contrary to Officer Di Natale's assertions that an officer can detain a citizen for refusing to identify themselves, an officer must be able to point to an objectively reasonable basis for suspecting criminal activity in order to detain a citizen. Finally, for an officer to have the legal authority to arrest an individual, they must have probable cause, which is a more demanding standard than reasonable suspicion that requires an officer to have sufficient information for a reasonable person to believe that the individual had committed a criminal act. Based on the body camera footage, a court would likely conclude that Mr. Daniels' detention was unlawful, as it did not seem that the officers had reasonable suspicion that Mr. Daniel was committing a crime. And, contrary to Officer Di Natale's assertions, an individual's mere refusal to identify themselves during a consensual encounter does not give rise to the reasonable suspicion necessary for an investigative detention. Likewise, a court would probably determine that Mr. Daniel's arrest was also unlawful because he did not have a legal duty to identify himself. And, as we discussed earlier in this episode, refusing to identify is not sufficient to support an obstruction charge.
You can
get detained for not identifying.
Can we speak to a supervisor at the station?
You're going to. You're literally going to see a supervisor.
Thank you.
All right?
Yes, thank you.
After their arrests, Mr. Daniel and Ms. Myra were both charged with obstruction. In his video, Long Island Audit reported that the prosecutor offered to drop the criminal charges in exchange for a civil fine, and Mr. Daniel and Ms. Myra refused the offer because they wanted to hold the officers responsible for their actions. He also stated that they are looking for an attorney to file a civil rights lawsuit, and that Mr. Daniel and Ms. Myra had another court date on January 17, 2023. Long Island Audit stated that an update video would be posted, but an update has yet to be made as of the date of writing this episode. Overall, Officer Di Natale and Officer Yeldell get an F for failing to conduct a legitimate investigation before attempting to identify anyone on the scene, maintaining a rude and condescending attitude throughout the encounter, and for escalating a peaceful interaction into a physical altercation, and likely an illegal arrest. Rather than contacting the individual who made the 911 call to confirm the complaint, the officers turned their attention to Mr. Daniel and Ms. Myra for refusing to answer a consensual question. At no point was the couple legally obligated to answer any of the questions asked of them by the officers, and their refusal should never have been perceived as grounds for intimidation. Like many other members of law enforcement featured on this channel, the Trenton officers were mistaken about the scope and language of their state's obstruction statute, and made an arrest based on this misinterpretation. This fact alone will likely afford Mr. Daniel and Ms. Myra an opportunity to contest the legality of their arrests and potentially file a legal claim for several different constitutional violations. This interaction highlights the importance of officers having a thorough understanding of the laws they are attempting to enforce, and the critical role that de-escalation plays in preventing unnecessary and potentially illegal arrests. Mr. Daniel and Ms. Myra get an A- for refusing to identify themselves when they were not legally obligated to do so, choosing to remain silent rather than potentially incriminating themselves, and for standing up to the officers despite their intimidating conduct and threats of arrest. When the Trenton officers arrived on the scene, Mr. Daniel and Ms. Myra were under no legal obligation to remain on the sidewalk, and it may have been in their best interest to leave the area immediately upon their arrival, rather than standing around and waiting for an engagement. It's also important to note that the right to remain silent must be verbally invoked in order to trigger the protections offered by the Fifth Amendment. Telling an officer that you, quote, will not answer any questions is not enough to render any statements inadmissible in court, and even silence can be used in court as evidence against a citizen. As discussed in many previous episodes, in order to properly invoke the right to remain silent, citizens must verbally state that they are invoking their Fifth Amendment rights before choosing to remain silent. I commend Mr. Daniel and Ms. Myra for having the courage and conviction to stand up for their rights. Be sure to check out the Long Island Audit channel for future updates on this case. Let us know if there is an interaction or legal topic you would like us to discuss in the comments.
My name is Christine. I live in Jersey City, New Jersey, and I went from working in healthcare to being a software engineer in 1 year.
On November 16, 2012, a call was made to 911 in Willoughby Hills, Ohio.
911, what's your emergency? What is going on? What is going on? Hello? What is going on? Who has the knife?
My sister, and I just woke up because I was yelling.
Okay, this is your sister?
Yeah, and she's doing my mom with a knife.
She's doing what to your mom with the knife? You need to take a deep breath for me so I can understand you.
No, I did.
When the police arrived on scene, 18-year-old Sabrina Zunic was walking out of her house, still holding a kitchen knife. Inside the home, the body of Lisa Knafill was discovered with almost 200 knife wounds covering her entire body. Sabrina was arrested and the investigation into the homicide began. Sabrina had been a foster child her entire life. She had been diagnosed with ADHD, anxiety, depression, and bipolar disorder. She frequently got into fights at school, and she struggled to learn and follow the rules. At the age of 16, Sabrina was placed with Kevin and Lisa Knafill, and she moved into their home in Willoughby Hills, Ohio. The Knafills already had 2 daughters, and Sabrina seemed to fit in well with them. Everything was looking up for Sabrina until her foster father Kevin began showing her more attention. During the summer of 2012, Sabrina and Kevin began a relationship that they kept hidden from the rest of the family. Sabrina had fallen for Kevin, so even though she had turned 18 and she didn't have to stay, she continued living with the Knafills. Kevin and his wife would argue about this often, and they even talked about divorce. Kevin had an $800,000 life insurance policy on his wife, and if they were to get divorced, he wouldn't receive any of the money. The police believe that even though Kevin was nowhere near the home when the incident took place, that he was the reason she was dead. Detectives on the case tried to interview Kevin, but he made sure to get himself a lawyer.
Were you and Lisa in the process of going through a divorce?
Are you going to talk to us about any of the situations that led up to what happened?
I talked to Detective Farmers and interviewed him about work, which I thought was probably the difference.
Okay.
But everybody knows where she was.
Well, we never got to talk at length about the sort of sequence of events and what happened. That's what we're just going to talk about.
We're just trying to figure out what happened that night. His wife was brutally murdered here, and we're trying to help him. Help us. He can help us in the investigation.
He wasn't within 100 miles of the house.
I understand that, but he was with them prior to leaving the house, so he can discuss what the house was like prior to him leaving.
We came down to talk to you about what you asked us to talk about. I asked you specifically on the phone what the subject matter was.
Correct.
We didn't have to come down.
Absolutely, you're right. Absolutely.
But we're not going to get into the relationship between Kevin and Lisa. It's just you got a bloody girl with a bloody knife.
You know what? I apologize for wasting your time then, because.
Well, how about your relationship with any of the other children in the household? I mean, how about your relationship with Sabrina? You didn't discuss anything with that?
No.
What
can I do for you? I can't read Orcish very well, but this looks like a report. Written by an Orc spy. Captain Vimes should see the Orc report you found, adventurer. He knows the Orcish language better than most, and he should know that there are Horde spies near Theramore. The captain is in the barracks on the northeastern side of Theramore Isle.
You need something?
Mr. Ignatz was just here with the bogbean leaves, and he told me you helped him out of some real trouble. Thank you, adventurer. I will ask my uncle to treat you to a feast the next time you visit the Blue Recluse in Stormwind. These will do fine. Thank you, adventurer. Now I'll try different cooking techniques on these tongues to find the best way to bring out their flavor. Eventually, I'll have a dish worthy of serving at the Blue Recluse in Stormwind. Another component of my new recipe is the shelled leg of a giant crab, and the crabs they have in Dustwallow, muck shells they call them, just won't do. I'm afraid the only suitable crabs live far away, in the Swamp of Sorrows. The shell of the crab leg is a key element of the dish's presentation, so I need pristine, unscarred legs. An adult crab might only have 1 or 2 such legs, and I need a lot in order to research my dish. So, adventurer, are you willing to travel? Well met. The guards of Theramore are the finest group of Alliance soldiers based in Calias. It is our duty to uphold the laws of the Alliance even so far away from our homes. What can I do for you? It's never good news when a guard's badge is brought to me. Sometimes it's a man or woman who's fallen in battle, and I'm left to bring the news to the grieving family. Other times, we never find out what happened to them, and other times it's even worse than that. I don't recognize the name of Lieutenant Paval Reith. Your best bet would be to check with Adjutant Tesorin. He keeps track of all the records for the Theramore Guard, from personnel to their equipment. He should be able to tell you who this Reith is with a quick check.
How are you? See you around.
I supply only the finest goods. See you later.
Need assistance? Alrighty then.
Looking for something specific? Have a good one.
You need something?
See you around.
How are you? Have a good one.
Need help? Go with honor, friend. I don't recognize the name of Lieutenant Paval Reith. Your best bet would be to check with Adjutant Tesorin. He keeps track of all the records for the Theramore Guard, from personnel to their equipment. He should be able to tell you who this Reith is with a quick check of his books. I'm no expert with the construction of arms and armor. Their use, yes, but not their making. This shield seems as ordinary as any, excepting the damage from the fire that engulfed the inn. I'm sorry I can't be of much help, adventurer, but I can refer you to someone who would be. Kaz Two-Sprocket, one of our best blacksmiths, works the forge at the smithy. Take the shield to him and see what he can tell you. Hoofprints, eh? It is true that there is an extraordinary amount of centaur activity in the lands near the Dustwallow Marsh. In brief excursions into the Barrens, we found their camps and holdings dotting the area. I'll send out Falgran Hastel, one of our trackers, to see if he can find where the tracks lead. A report from an orc spy. How did you find this? No matter. Let's see what it says. Hello, adventurer. You'd like information about a specific member of the Theramore Guard?
What are you
Reith,
looking for?
was it? Just give
See
me
you
a moment
later.
to find the right book. Redden, Redpath. Ah, here it is. Lieutenant Paval Reith joined the Theramore Guard along with most of the recruits that came across the sea with Lady Proudmoore. Enlisted with the Marines of Kul Tiras at the age of 16. Distinguished service promotions, listed as missing. Missing. That would be Tesorin's kind way of saying traitor. No doubt he's one of those fools so blindly loyal to Admiral Dalen that he turned traitor. Isn't that a delicious irony? The deserters accuse us of betraying the Alliance. It has been a struggle maintaining a presence in the marsh, but through strength of our resolve, we have been able to maintain several defensive watchtowers throughout the area. The latest information and scouting reports I have received indicate that a group of deserters has squatted in our abandoned tower at Lost Point, southeast of the inn. The deserters' leader is a man named Jackin. See if you can get some information out of him. Be warned, adventurer. He may be a tough nut to crack.
Interesting piece of iron you have here. Definitely not made by any of the blacksmiths I know over on this side of the sea, and it's certainly not my work. Ah, I almost missed this! The leather strap on the back must have burned off, but it seems like it was made to fit a large person. I'd guess a Tauren, actually. That's about all I can tell you. Tell Captain Vimes I'm sorry I couldn't be of more help.
That's not much information to work on, but we'll have to keep it in mind. Hopefully some of the other pieces of this mystery will fall into place and paint a more helpful picture of what happened.
Thanks for coming.
Is there anything we need to know?
What's up, guys? My name is Mike, and I'm here to get stoned. Today, I'm...
That's still recharging.
Bonebiter is better. Bonebiter is better, chat. And I'm aware of it, and I'm gonna get Bonebiter, don't worry, but I wanna do Whirlwind for the tradition. It's the warrior tradition way. Today's Czar's day off. I think he's popping into chatting.
Good day to you.
Ah, that's the spice.
Now here's some swampy good stew.
tomorrow.
Eye juice is good juice for drinking. Too bad most critters only have 2 eyes. But spiders have lots of eyes.
really
Lots and
high for
lots.
us,
And dark mist eye juice is tasty, smooth, and salty. Unpopped spider eyes, I taste them already. Dark mist spiders are west of here, in the dark mist cavern. You figure the spiders are named after the
Yeah, we're
cave?
doing SM
Or is
tomorrow.
it the
It's
other way
okay,
around?
even if it's 33. As long as the tank is like beefy. Oh my god! I lost. Holy moly. Holy. Yo, 2 strength 10, agility 3.
In May of 1973, 8 divers were exploring a sinkhole in Australia known as the Shaft when something went horrifyingly wrong. This is their story. Today's video is brought to you by Babbel, one of the top language learning apps in the world. When I started this channel, I never anticipated learning unfamiliar names and words I would need to pronounce from places all across the world. Like, for example, many of the videos in my mountain climbing series take place in the French Alps. And despite having taken French in school for years, the pronunciations just aren't very natural to me anymore. That's one of the reasons why I've been thrilled to collaborate with Babbel over the past few months. With Babbel's speech recognition, I've been able to improve my pronunciation just like this.
Original, original.
Original, original. But what sets Babbel apart is its approach to teaching concepts through a variety of methods, similar to how a new language is taught in school. At least that's how I remember it when I was learning French. This is possible because Babbel's lessons are designed by real language teachers. It's hard to emphasize enough how effective this is for speeding up your learning and enabling you to engage in real-world conversations. And the best part is that I can access all of Babbel's lessons from my phone when I'm not at my computer. With all of these features, it's been super easy and enjoyable to brush up on my French speaking, so all of those years in school aren't completely lost. So, I'm curious to hear what languages all of you would want to learn, because right now, Babbel is offering 60% off a subscription for all Scary Interesting viewers, and this comes with a 20-day money-back guarantee. So there's no risk in giving it a try. The link on screen now or in the description below. So, the population distribution in the state of South Australia is really weird. The largest city is the city of Adelaide, just over 1 million people. But the next largest city is Mount Gambier at just 33,000. This makes the second largest city in the entire state over 40 times smaller than the next largest. In fact, the population of Adelaide is larger than all of the rest of the cities in the state combined, which is just kind of weird to think about. And so although Mount Gambier is technically the second largest city in the state, it's really just a small city. Despite its size though, the city is considered to be the most important settlement in the so-called Limestone Coast region. It sits right on the border of South Australia and Victoria, just a few kilometers north of the southern coast. It also happens to have been built on the slopes of a literal volcano, which is also named Mount Gambier. Both the city and the surrounding area are famous for some of these volcanic features, like the limestone topography, crystalline lakes, caves, and sinkholes. On the outskirts of the city are a bunch of farm fields, and these extend all the way to the shores to the south. One of these is just a small 5-acre area between Mount Gambier and the ocean owned by some dairy farmers known as Thompson's Paddock. In 1938, a farmer was on the field at Thompson's Paddock on a piece of equipment being pulled by his horses when all of a sudden one of his horses tripped and stumbled over something in the grass. The farmer thought that was weird, so he stopped his horses, got off the piece of equipment and walked over to where the horse tripped. What he found was a hole in the ground about a foot across that he hadn't ever noticed before. He got down on his hands and knees to take a look into the hole, and to his surprise, the hole extended to what looked to be over 20 feet down, and then at the bottom, he could see water. This on its own is kind of amazing and creepy, but this was only just the beginning. It's not clear how long the farmer had this field, or why he hadn't noticed the hole in the ground before, and no one is really sure if the horse had caused the ground to collapse, or if the hole had always been there, and the farmer just hadn't noticed. Either way, that leads to the next question. If the horse had caused the hole to open up, doesn't that mean that it could collapse even further and that the area around the hole was now at risk of collapsing? To make matters worse, you could see from the surface that the narrow opening extended for maybe 2 or 3 feet, but after that, the sides weren't visible. It looked like it widened out, sort of like an upside-down funnel. In a worst-case scenario, imagine someone had been walking the field and had accidentally stepped into the opening. They would have fallen 20 feet to the water below, and then because of the shape of the upper section, they would have had no way to climb back out. All they've been able to do is tread water and scream helplessly. This was obviously kind of alarming for the farmer as well, because following the discovery of this opening, he decided to try to fill the pit with rocks. So over the next little while, he began to bring soccer ball-sized stones to the opening and just started dropping them into the water down below. One by one, the rocks would make a big splash and then disappear into the dark water, never to be seen again. They reached the first dozen rocks and they just kept disappearing. Then they dumped several dozen into the water. The dozens turned into 100, then hundreds, and there were still no trace of the rocks down below. By the time they eventually gave up, they'd probably dumped thousands of rocks into the strange opening, and still, not a single rock could be seen down in the water. It was like the hole was bottomless. In the end, the farmer would just have to be cautious of the opening and hope that it didn't collapse any further. As you might imagine, news spread of this weird occurrence, and soon enough, people were coming to explore the hole. It was eventually determined to be a limestone sinkhole, where slowly the water had dissolved the rocks below, leading to this large opening just a few feet below the surface.
Eventually, this foot-wide hole was widened to be about 3 feet or 1 meter so that could be more easily explored. Then, in the mid-60s, a diver was lowered into the cave opening for the first time. From the surface, he was lowered 23 feet or 7 meters before finally touching down on the water surface, and what he saw was that it was actually more like a small lake. Right below the entrance it was narrow, but by the time you're at the water surface, the room is already 56 feet or 17 meters wide. In addition to that, on a sunny day around noon, the sunlight shines directly through the opening and creates a sapphire blue beam of light that lights up the room and the water. From then on, the cave was given the name the Shaft because of this shaft of light. From the water surface, the diver began scuba diving down into the cave and found that it just continued to widen out the deeper and deeper you go. In this first exploration, he got down to about 69 feet or 21 meters before ending the dive and deciding to come back up. But the craziest part was that from where he had stopped, he could see all of the rocks that had been dumped into the cave years before. All of those hundreds of rocks looked like a little anthill down at the bottom of this massive room, and they were still at least 50 feet from where he had stopped. The cave was later mapped to have one massive chamber where the rocks were located, and then 2 incredibly deep descending arms that extend out in almost opposite directions. The main chamber is 460 feet long and 260 feet wide at its widest, and the top of the rock pile is 118 feet or 36 meters below the surface. Then from the main chamber, there's a tunnel that extends northwest to a depth of 260 feet or 80 meters. And then on the opposite side of that, there's another tunnel that extends all the way to 407 feet or 124 meters depth. It's thought that these tunnels could stretch all the way to the southern shores as part of the intricate freshwater drainage system flowing through the mountains in the area. There are also several cliffs, overhangs, and restrictions in each of these corridors that make for some interesting features on the way down. These features, coupled with the crystal clear water and the sheer size to explore, make it a caver's dream. Importantly, a really accurate map didn't get made until all the way in 1984, but already by a decade earlier in 1973, 8,000 dives had already taken place inside the shaft. During all of those dives, the full depth of the cave wasn't known and a full map hadn't been made. For all intents and purposes, it was considered to be bottomless. The newness of cave diving, the limitations of the then available equipment, meant that cavers just sort of went to the edge of the charted area and then stared off into the abyss, wondering how deep the cave went. In May of 1973, a team of 9 divers planned to make what they thought might be a record dive in the shaft. On the 26th, they all arrived in Mount Gambier and set up tents at a campground near the famous Blue Crater Lake. Their goal was to reach the edge of the so-called perimeter at 250 feet of depth. This is essentially the edge of where the light from above filters through. Any deeper and the angle of the ceiling obscures the light, and from then on, the water is almost pitch black. This also happens to be right around an area known as the drop-off. It's a point in the cave where the bottom is no longer visible from the edge above. That's what gave the shaft this reputation for being bottomless, because standing at the ledge, you can't see anything down below, but it clearly extends much farther. All 9 of the divers planned to make this attempt were dive instructors, but because this was a fairly ambitious undertaking, they planned to do a practice dive and set up some equipment prior to their real attempt. So, the following day on the 27th, they got to the farmhouse on Thompson's Paddock, signed the guest book, and then drove into the grassy field where the entrance is located. They parked alongside the opening and then set up the famous tripod hoist system that many of you will probably be familiar with. This hoist is used to lower the divers into the water down below, and incredibly, despite having been widened, the hole is still too narrow for divers to be lowered wearing their equipment. It has to be lowered separately. On the way up as well, a wire ladder is set up for the divers to climb their way out. Once everyone was in the water, they were amazed to see just how big the room was already at the surface. Next, they set up something known as a shot line, which is what they were there to do that day. This was a line from the surface that was weighted and led directly down to the rock pile. This would make their descent smoother for the record attempt and give them more time to reach the edge. On the practice day, the deepest they went was about 200 feet, which was just around the perimeter of the rock pile and well within the light of the opening. While they were down there though, they could see the famous edge off in the distance, which was their goal. The bottom of the cave extended horizontally and then just disappeared. After finishing this practice dive and getting a feel for the cave, they returned to Mount Gambier to replace some of the batteries on their lights and refill all of their air cylinders. Then the next day on the 28th, they were back at the opening at noon, suited up and getting lowered back down. One of the divers, a woman named Joan, decided not to dive that day, so it would only be 8 of them instead of 9. She decided to stay up and help with supplies and make food for the rest of them. So the divers who would be entering the cave that day would be Robert, John, Peter, Gordon, Larry, and then 3 siblings, Glenn, Stephen, and Christine. The others all dived back down to the rock pile at 130 feet and then continued toward the tunnel where the ledge was located. At about 180 feet, Robert started to really feel the effects of nitrogen narcosis. This is when the nitrogen from the gas divers breathe dissolves in the blood and creates a sort of impaired, almost drunken feeling. This was a bit earlier than he normally felt it, but it was already significant enough that he would need to head back up a little bit to dissipate the feeling. Now is maybe a good time to mention that because diving and cave diving were so new at the time, the protocols used hadn't really been established like they are today. There were a lot of amateurs who were participating in it who really shouldn't have been. Like, for example, these divers, although they were instructors, they only had experience of open water in perfectly clear, bright water. The second thing is that there was no requirement to be cave certified. Anyone could just sort of dive wherever they wanted with minimal oversight. But the final and most alarming thing was that the safety protocols were wildly different than what they are today. This group of divers planned to do a dive to a depth of 250 feet on regular air. If you're at all familiar with diving, you know how insane this is. Today, the maximum depth recommended to use regular air is just 130 feet. Beyond that, nitrogen narcosis starts to kick in and can impair your judgment and motor function. At around 185 feet, the air actually becomes toxic and can cause convulsive seizures in some instances. If you were to have a seizure at depth, your mouthpiece just falls out and then you drown. So, taking all that into account, there were now 8 divers in the water on regular air, already at 180 feet. Robert signaled to the others that he was heading back to the rock pile, and they signaled back to him that they were going to keep going. He then swam around the rock pile, circling it and checking the area for animal bones that might have sunk to the bottom. About 8 minutes later, he saw Glenn's torch coming toward him. By then, Robert was close to being out of air, and so was Glenn, who had been watching his gauges. The two of them caught up with one another and then surfaced at around the same time. Larry surfaced around the same time as well, and then 30 seconds later, Peter surfaced and he had essentially no air left. He also said that he hadn't seen any of the other divers. All of a sudden, everyone's stomach dropped as the realization set in, especially Glenn, whose brother and sister were still down in the water with next to no air left. A few minutes earlier, the group that had continued on without Robert were swimming and taking pictures until they got to about 200 feet. Glenn and the others were swimming along a ledge along the bottom, and he saw his sister just a few feet away from him. Everything was normal, the light above was still bright, and about 5 minutes total had passed since they started their dive. Around this time, Glenn was feeling kind of groggy from the narcosis and decided that he'd gone far enough as well. He checked his gauges and saw that he was getting low on air and knew that since everyone had the same amount of air, they'd also be running low. To be on the safe side, he decided to head back up, but before he did, he wanted to signal his sister Christine to let her know that she should probably head up too. He went to tap her on the shoulder, but before he did, she started kicking her fins away from him and then out of reach. Not wanting to spend any more time down there, he figured they'd probably all follow along not too long after him anyway, so he just started up for the surface. Then he met up with Robert, and the two of them surfaced together. Around this time is when all hell broke loose in the cave, and a combination of factors led to this being perhaps the deadliest cave diving incident in history. Right before Glenn started heading up, Peter was also feeling pretty impaired by the narcosis and wanted to check Glenn's depth gauge. He swam over to him, but Glenn started heading up before Peter could read it. Peter sat there for a moment, scanning the clear water at the bottom, and then noticed 2 other divers moving towards the exit. He checked how much air he had left, and that's when he realized that time was up. Then he turned to where he thought the exit was, and realized that the cave had gone almost completely dark, and he had no idea which way the exit was. That day, shortly after the group entered the cave, clouds moved into the area and severely limited the amount of light shining through the opening. Peter started swimming around, searching for the exit, but in just a few short moments, the area had become heavily silted and divers were scattered all over the place. 3 of these divers had been grouped together near the deepest section any of them had explored. In order, Christine was in front, Gordon was next, and then Larry was in behind. Larry and Gordon checked their gauges and realized they were dangerously low in air. They signaled it was time to head up, and then in a panic started swimming almost directly upward rather than diagonally with the ceiling. In these limestone caves, sometimes pieces of rock cleave off and create dome-shaped depressions in the ceiling. It's thought that the expelled gases from the divers had collected in one of these pockets and created a mirror-like effect on the ceiling, similar to what the surface near the entrance would have looked like. In their impaired state, their flashlights bounced off this mirror, and in their panic, they thought they were swimming in the right direction. Then they would have swam directly up and hit the ceiling right above them. Gordon and Christine started frantically waving their flashlights around, terrified, looking for the exit. Right then, Larry's light went out. He dropped away from the ceiling for a moment and miraculously turned back on, and because he had drifted down, they started to see another diver off in the distance. He swam toward the diver, and then the angle was just enough for him to see the real entrance far ahead. He bolted for the entrance and surfaced right around the time Glenn and Robert did. Peter had also managed to find his way out of the silt and surfaced right after Larry. Upon seeing that 4 people were still missing, including his brother and sister, Glenn immediately grabbed a spare tank and dove back down to try to find them. He got to the edge of the cliff at 225 feet and found his brother's flashlight and camera resting on the bottom. He also found that any further in was completely silted out. The visibility was basically zero. But desperately wanting to find his siblings, he went over the drop-off and into the silt. As soon as he entered the cloud, he couldn't even see the hand in front of his face, and he started to panic. He immediately swam back out and then to the edge of the rock pile, and then he just stared into the abyss for some time, hoping to see any sign of them. Eventually, he was forced to return to the surface. Peter went down following Glenn's return, but he also found nothing. By then, an ambulance had arrived, and everyone knew there was no hope of finding anyone alive. Shortly after that, police arrived and planned for a body recovery the following day.
What's new about arches? They've been around for over 1,000 years. But these days, arches and curves are definitely in. We're going to show you how to incorporate one, no matter your budget, showing you the easiest way to DIY a painted arch detail to make any space a little more interesting. Having an on-trend home doesn't have to come with a huge price tag. Showroom Steals is all about breaking down the latest trends and providing tips and tricks to get the same look in your home for less. So, let's talk about arches. Architectural arches, to be specific. Arches were...
The next day, police divers went down into the shaft and got to 200 feet, but found that the cave was still very silted out. They were already at the limit of their capabilities and weren't able to locate any of the bodies that day, or the day after during a second search. Following the second search, police called it off entirely until they could get additional training from the Navy because the depth of the recovery was groundbreaking and pushing the edge of the training they had. This would take at least several months to get their recovery squad up to speed. In January of the following year, before the bodies had been recovered, the landowners let a film crew who were making a cave diving documentary enter the cave to do some filming. The crew had already filmed several of the others in the area and wanted to include the shaft as well. On the 22nd, they got down to about 50 feet down, and using professional lighting equipment, they lit up the cave so bright that it was like daylight inside. While they were getting set up, a technician was looking at 2 of his teammates when he noticed what looked like a third person behind them. Kind of freaked out, they went over to inspect the area and realized that it was a body in a wetsuit. They immediately stopped all filming and surfaced and called the police to let them know someone had been found. The next day, police retrieved the body, which was stuck under a narrow ledge just 50 feet deep into the water. They went down to 180 feet that same day and still weren't able to find any of the others. The one they did recover was later determined to be Stephen, one of the siblings. By March of that year, the landowners had become increasingly uncomfortable that there were still 3 people somewhere down in the cave, so they sought the help of some more experienced divers with better equipment. On March 9th of 1974, this team of divers went down and began a search of their own and would find a person lying on their back at 185 feet on the bottom. They also found another person directly underneath them. Then, 20 feet deeper, they found the final individual, the body of John, beneath a rock ledge. His body wasn't able to be recovered until a month later in April because of the depth and the way the body was wedged. Almost a year earlier, on that fateful day, it's thought that Christine and Gordon had run out of air while in the dome-shaped pocket on the ceiling. It's been suggested that they died holding one another, knowing they were out of air and there was nothing they could do. This is why they were recovered so closely together. It's not clear exactly who saw John, but one of the survivors mentioned seeing another diver swimming strongly deeper into the cave while everyone else was returned to the surface. This is thought to have been John, who was found the deepest end. It's thought that he was severely affected by nitrogen narcosis, and that's why he was going in the opposite direction. Finally, not much is known about Stephen's final moments. He was obviously found much higher than the rest of them along the ceiling instead of the bottom. When he was found, his buoyancy device was inflated, which kept him buoyant and stuck to the roof. It's possible that in the silt or in the dark, he tried to find the exit by floating to the ceiling and then crawling along it. He might have then run out of air before making it out. However, since no one saw him, we'll never really know his final moments. This accident, as far as I can tell, is the worst in cave diving history. And in the few years preceding this incident, there were several other fatal incidents in nearby sinkholes in the Mount Gambier area. The shaft disaster was the final straw and led to the establishment of the Cave Divers Association of Australia with the goal of regulating the industry to prevent further tragedies from occurring. With the benefit of hindsight, we know that these divers should not have entered the cave without specific knowledge of cave diving. It's also easy to criticize their use of air instead of a mix, but back then, specialized gas mixtures just weren't widely available. They also should have used guidelines to explore those uncharted sections to avoid getting lost when the cave silted out or when it became dark. And in fact, these divers knew that lines should be used, but decided not to use them because of the size of the group they had. They knew that the lines would likely get tangled, which would have been even more dangerous. In reality, for a dive like they did, they should have simply had a smaller group where lines could have been used. Thankfully, following the establishment of the CDAA and other similar organizations, the rate of cave dive deaths has been drastically reduced ever since. Hello everyone, my name is Sean and welcome to Scary Interesting. Thank you all so much for watching, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.
Try Febreze Small Spaces. Just press firmly and it continuously fights odors in the air and on soft surfaces for 45 days.
I gotta beat him because he cursed me to die yesterday. He really wanted me to die yesterday. I can't die. Yeah, he said it to me, Hunter.
I can't do that yet. My ability isn't ready yet.
You couldn't ask for a better instructor
Bro,
than him.
why does he sound so like two-head? Look at this, ready?
What do you need directions to? Which profession trainer would you be looking for? Well, you've come to the right place to learn mining, boyo. Geoffram Bouldertoe himself resides at the Deep Mountain Mining Guild. You couldn't ask for a better instructor than him.
Why does he sound so Scottish? Yo, thank you, Yamato. Appreciate it, man. Boyo, who says boyo? That's so funny, man.
Reef, that coward, we threw him out of camp because he insisted on raiding the supplies of the ogres up at Brackenwall Village. We're not so many in number that we could stand up to those mindless brutes. He crossed the line one too many times, so we left him to fend for himself. Now, I helped you out, so why don't you help us out and forget you bumped into us?
Step on up. Hello. Help you find something? Have a good one.